In this lesson, we are going to look into ASP.NET impersonation and Kerberos delegation. Impersonation is most commonly used as a way of checking whether a client is authorized to perform a particular action, while delegation is a way of flowing impersonation capabilities along with the client's identity to a backend service. Delegation is distinct from identity flow, and because it transfers the ability to impersonate the client without possession of the client's password, it's a much higher privileged operation than identity flow. Both impersonation and delegation require that the client have a Windows identity. If a client doesn't have a Windows identity, then the only option available is to flow the client's identity to the second service. For a service to control access to local resources on a per-user basis, it needs to run a process under the end-user security context, that is, to impersonate the user. Impersonation can be configured for a specific user so that the service always runs processes under the same account's credential, or it can be configured for authenticated users. For a service to control access to remote resources on a per-user basis, it needs to be able to act on behalf of the end user when interacting with remote services. This requires the mid-tier service, such as an IIS or SQL server, to be configured for delegation, so it can handle service tickets on behalf of the end user when accessing resources on another host. Multi-tier applications require both impersonation and delegation to be configured. To control local resource access in a web application, we need to enable ASP.NET impersonation for authenticated users in IIS, either at the server or website level. Impersonation can also be enabled on the fly in the code, so that it's performed only when a particular section of the code is being executed. But if there is a problem, it may be very difficult to troubleshoot it. The application pool account will need to be assigned the user right impersonate a client after authentication on the local host for impersonation to work. Impersonation is required for Kerberos delegation if you want to access remote resources under the end-user security context. Here we see how to enable impersonation and negotiate authentication for a website. We configure Windows authentication under the website's configuration editor. Here we set Windows authentication options. These are default values since Windows 2012 server. Out persist non-NTLM set to true reconfigures Kerberos from request-based to session-based authentication protocol in order to improve service performances. Use app pool credentials set to true instructs the system to use application pool credentials for decrypting the service tickets. Out persist single request set to false leaves NTLM in its default mode, which makes it session-based authentication protocol. Use kernel mode set to true enables kernel mode authentication, which then uses system key for decrypting the service tickets. It improves service performance, and Microsoft recommends keeping it on, even when we configure a specific website to use application pool credentials, which is required if the IIS hosts multiple applications or the application is load balanced across multiple hosts. Windows Extended Protection for Authentication safeguards the authentication credentials transferred between a client and server when using integrated Windows authentication. It prevents credential relay attacks by implementing a protocol based on RFC 5056 titled On the Use of Channel Bindings to Secure Channels. It must be enabled on both client and server. In IIS, it's disabled by default.